So this just is a real basic image of money in elections and what that looks like as far as dividing it by hard money and soft money. Now you might ask, as far as why the reasons to control election spending. And once again, there's some key words as we look at the bullet points here. To control election spending, as far as stopping corruption and undue influence, as it has to do with access and special treatment, the possible distortion of the election process by big spending, political equality, and enabling candidates to compete equitably for office. Reduce the amount of time. Many times I've heard people say, I'd like to run for office, I just don't have the money to do it. Reduce the time and effort that elected officials and candidates expend on raising money. And preventing or pressuring donors for campaign contributions. And through disclosure, one of our key words, that voters have sufficient information to make the choices as far as the individual that they want to vote for. We're focused on South Carolina as far as campaign contributions and what the states can do. And of course, these are very general, but ensuring, and certainly the League of Women Voters does these things, voter rights and access, making sure that elections are citizen funded, clean election reforms, and getting disclosure. So things that from our perspective and our state that can be done. And finally, voting. As I said earlier, the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We support good government. And so we ask that you vote in local elections, state elections, national elections, and encourage those around you to be active and involved. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move to very quickly our bios. And we have Gibbs Knotts, and from the Department of Political Science at College of Charleston, and he's been the department chair and is currently interim dean, and has a number of works on political participation in Southern politics. Jamie Lovegrove is a political writer, and he has experience not only in South Carolina, but also in Texas, and is a graduate of Northwestern. And Lynn Teague, originally from South Carolina, Orangeburg in fact, is an archaeologist and was on the faculty of Arizona State Museum and University of Arizona. And she has served as an ethics advocate lobbyist for the League of Women Voters of South Carolina. So the backgrounds of our speakers, all very well versed on this topic, span a wide range of interests and expertise. So we're going to have each speaker speak for 5 minutes, just as an opening statement. And I'm going to start with Gibbs Knotts. If you could go ahead, Gibbs, and give your opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Paula. I'm so honored to be here and to be on the panel with Lynn and with Jamie. And it's just such an important topic. I mean, I know it's a topic that the League members are concerned about, and I'm so excited that so many people got on the call today, but I'm not convinced, you know, how much this is on people's radar screens across the general public. And so I think it's probably important to spread the word and talk a little bit more about why you should care about this issue. I'm teaching a campaigns and elections class right now at the College of Charleston, and it's meeting in person. I've got about half the students that are coming in, and we're all spread out, and then I've got half the students joining us on Zoom. And we talked about campaign finance earlier in the week. And the way I started that section was to talk about these two competing values that we have in the American political system, although there certainly exist in political systems, democratic political systems across the world. And that is a fervent and strong commitment to freedom of speech. And so, I do think it's important to recognize that, candidates have a right to make their case. And if you support a candidate, you have a right to make the case for or against that candidate. And that is a fundamental bedrock principle in our American system. But kind of weighing against that is many of the things that Paula was talking about, this desire, this really duty to protect the corrupting influence of money in our political system. We have the duty to preserve the integrity of the democratic process. And, the courts have been pretty clear, especially since Citizens United, which I know we're going to talk more about that 2010 court case, that, people have the right to spend money to support candidates. But again, democracy good democracy depends on disclosure, making sure that voters know who's advocating for or against a candidate. And then whoever gets elected, being able to hold those elected officials responsible to know who their supporters are and who's spending money for them. So for these reasons, both kind of during the electoral process itself and once they get in, dark money, because there's not that disclosure, is particularly concerning. I guess the final thing I'd say is that, it's a confusing topic as I tried to prepare today and learn more about it. I mean, it is, you can't even keep the groups straight. They all sound the same and you can't even tell if it's a Democratic group or a Republican group. It's like every dark money group I've ever heard of, like I want to support just when I look at their name, because it's like, who doesn't want to be for Priorities USA? I mean, that just seems so good. But I think that adds to the confusion, and I think that's part of it. I know we're going to tackle that a little bit more, but I think I'll stop there and be happy and look forward to the discussion as it proceeds tonight.
Okay, thanks, Gibbs. Jamie, we're going to have you go second with your 5-minute intro.
Sure, thanks, Paul, and thanks to you all for having me and for tuning in. My colleague Andy Brown and I have written fairly extensively about dark money over the past few years. Andy wrote a really excellent in-depth project in March of last year about the spending of dark money during the 2018 midterm elections in South Carolina. What he found was that there was at least $6 million spent on just by dark money groups on the 2018 midterms. We also did a story just a few months ago. There was a state Senate GOP primary runoff election. The Senate Judiciary Chairman, Luke Rankin, who is from Conway, was up for, had a competitive challenger in his primary. He went to a runoff, and we were able to calculate that at least $875,000 were spent by dark money groups on that race alone. That was just a primary in a state Senate race, and that was exponentially more than the candidates themselves in that race spent. So these groups are far outspending the candidates. Part of the reason why they can do that is because of the fact that they have no limits on what they can raise and on what they can spend, whereas the candidates can only raise up to the limit for individuals, which makes it much harder because you need to actually raise from far more people. The dark money groups can raise from one or two very, very wealthy people or wealthy corporations, and then spend all of that money. And the reason I say at least $875,000 in this state Senate race, and at least $16 million or $6 million in the 2018 midterms, is because we actually have no idea how much total money was spent in these races by dark money groups. And that brings me to an important point, which is, while dark money has been a problem all over the country, or certainly in the eyes of ethics advocates has been a problem in states all over the country, South Carolina has a particularly egregiously weak set of laws when it comes to dark money. When I say a weak set of laws, they don't really have many laws when it comes to dark money. We are one of only 3 states, I believe the others are Alabama and Indiana, that do not require these groups to even tell us how much they're spending. They don't have to file anything at all, actually. And so we don't know the total amount that they have spent. The only way that Andy and I were able to figure out or to get an idea of how much they might have spent is to go through the television ad contracts that they have to buy. So we go and we look for every single TV ad contract that was bought in that race. We calculate all of them together, and we can get a sense of approximately how much they spent, or at least a minimum of how much they spent, because they could be spending on other types of expenditures too, mailers and digital ads. So I think it's very important to note that that South Carolina is unusual in that sense, that we know even less about these groups than citizens in other states do. And, lawmakers tend to appreciate the problem of dark money when it comes for them. Senator Rankin, as I mentioned, is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He could play a very influential role in changing these laws. And, when we spoke to him after he won his runoff, and after hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent in dark money trying to unseat him, he said, yeah, I think we should probably go ahead and take a look at these laws and hopefully reform them. The problem is until some of these folks do get that money spent against them, they do not necessarily see what is so problematic about it. So, at the end of the day, as we spoke to ethics advocates and we spoke to campaign finance experts, it's they said at the end of the day, almost all of these folks will end up getting targeted by it one way or another, unless they try to rein it in or at least put some kind of regulations on it. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and appreciate you having me here.
Thanks, Jamie. And Lynn Teague, 5 minutes of an introduction on the topic.
Okay, yes, glad to. I've actually been working on this for the League since the fall of 2012. And that is when the governor at that time, Nikki Haley, established the South Carolina Commission on Ethics Reform. And that was a very broad consideration, but one of the things we zeroed in on was the dark money problem. And Jamie actually was a little too kind to South Carolina, because it isn't just the amounts that don't have to be reported. We leave out an entire category of organizations. The graphic that was up earlier shows the federal situation, which you have disclosure for C4s that do not devote all of their attention to trying to influence elections. In South Carolina, a federal court case knocked down our committee definition, so that even those groups that admit freely that they exist to influence elections are not required to do anything, not required to disclose. And so we have 2 classes of dark money in the state, one of which you would think would be pretty easy to fix. The one that is organizations that freely admit that they want to influence elections. And I would add, this is not just candidates, this is ballot measures too. So this would be something like when Act 388 came up. A lot of people put money into the Act 388 campaign because it was worth a lot of money to them. It wasn't clear where all of them were coming from. But at this point, we have both problems, and we have not been able to move an inch on either side in 8 years, in spite of the fact that we've gotten bills filed every single time. And we have gotten strong support sometimes. When Larry Martin was chair of Judiciary, he was a very strong advocate for all of the ethics measures, including dark money. Ironically, in fact, double irony, he was knocked out by dark money in his primary. And that dark money was from the Trial Attorneys Association, as is we found out pretty easily. Everybody, at first, no one knew where it was coming from. And nothing in their ads had much to do with anything the trial lawyers were really concerned about. They apparently realized that the Pickens electorate was not going to get too hot under the collar about tort limits and other things that were really primary for them. And so that wasn't where their ads went. And even Senator Martin's adversary in the primary, I think, was genuinely clueless on where this was coming from. So as Jamie mentioned, then Senator Rankin has recently been attacked by large amounts of large money, but he sits as chair of judiciary because Larry Martin was knocked out by large amounts of dark money. So the state is awash in it. We are only one of 2 states that require, us and Indiana are the only ones that require nothing at all about either class of money. And it is greatly distorting our politics. And people are simply, I think, not adequately aware. And when we talk about doing something about it, as I said, we've had bills for 8 years. Neither party has been, can claim to have been the white knight on the horse racing in to save the day. Both parties have obstructed bills that would have helped. And both parties have had people who were good and worked hard to try to get something done. So very difficult situation in South Carolina. I'll leave that there for now.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. What we're going to do is move to a series of 7 or 8 questions. As I said earlier, our speakers will have 10 minutes total to address the question, and they're gonna have to figure out informally who's gonna address what, but we may not have time for all 3 to address every single question. So we're gonna start with the question, what's the history of dark money? And I'll put that question out for our speakers.
I'll say a little bit first off, Paula, this started as a Republican thing. Democrats were kind of staying away from it. And then in 2012, when President Obama was up for re-election, I think he sort of gave in, and that Priorities USA Super PAC was formed. And they knew who was giving to that, but it was sort of dipping your toe into this sort of new environment. And by 2016, the Democrats were also in the dark money game. And there is a little bit of this, like, the Democrats, even today, I think they sort of feel like, they like to make changes, but they have to have dark money to get into a position of power to be able to make those changes. So it's a little bit of they're sort of like, we can't give it up and we can't disarm. It's almost like a nuclear arms race or something like that. And so, in 2016, conservative dark money dwarfed dark money from more liberal groups like 4-1. But I'm really glad Lynn made that point, and I think it's an important one. Even when you look nationally, the 2018s were a really good election year for House Democrats in particular, and Democrats actually outspent Republicans nationally with dark money in 2018. And so that's sort of a quick overview. It's not a long history, but it's something that has really, really accelerated, certainly since Citizens United in 2010.
One thing I think that's useful to throw in there, of course, as you started earlier by saying, Gibbs, there's this tension between freedom of speech and this whole issue and public knowledge. And of course, I was raised by my mother, who told me, consider the source. When you get information, consider the source. We're not able to do that. And so that's what we're weighing. And there have been a series of federal court cases since Citizens United, which have specifically addressed disclosure. Because what Citizens United did was say, you can pour this money out in huge, unlimited quantities. But Citizens United also said, we recognize that disclosure is important, so citizens can evaluate what they're hearing. Is this a reliable source? Is this someone I would wish to trust? And immediately that was challenged in a series of cases. And actually the most promising thing that's happened has happened very recently, within just a little over a month. Last month, DC Circuit Appeals Court took the appeal on a case between Crew and the Federal Election Commission about their rules, and the Federal Election Commission being supported by dark money groups. And in this case, because they had a rule that to require disclosure from a C4 group, a group that was not totally devoted to elections, you had to identify their donation with a particular campaign message, a particular independent expenditure. And so what the federal courts are now saying is, no, that's not true. If somebody donates to a group because they expect it to try to influence elections, even if that isn't their main thing, that is, you can require disclosure. Now, I have drawn attorneys and legislators at the State House attention to this so far without getting a lot of progress. But that has been one of our fundamental back and forths legally.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Did the Citizens United case influence the presence of dark money, and in what ways?
Gibbs, you teach this.
Yeah, so one of the big things about Citizens United, if there's one sentence I want my students to take away, you know, when they talk about Citizens United, is this, you know, this thing that I think even President Obama spoke out in one of the State of the Union addresses, was like, you know, that unions and corporations also had a right to speech and they could spend money. And that really, you know, people were saying, well, you know, where in the Constitution in the First Amendment does it talk about, you know, free speech rights for unions and corporations? And so that was a huge game changer, because obviously those are, particularly corporations, have considerable resources, and if they now can pour unlimited amounts of money into the political system, it has, you know, a very, you know, can have a very, very, very big impact on, you know, who wins and loses in elections.
You know, one thing I will just say, you know, that's legally interesting about Citizens United is that, and about the Supreme Court's rulings on campaign finance in general, is that, you know, of course, the Supreme Court, you know, the basis of a lot of Supreme Court jurisprudence is this idea of precedent, that the Supreme Court follows precedent, and once it makes decisions, it tries to rule on any similar issues within that same framework. Citizens United overturned multiple decisions and that the Supreme Court had made in prior years. And, you know, which indicates that if there is one issue where the justices are sort of willing to reconsider their prior beliefs about how the campaign finance laws should be interpreted, this is one of them. I'll also say that it's been a few years since I have read the opinion, but I recall very strongly Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, wrote in his opinion that he did not think that the sort of the doomsaying about the impact of unlimited spending in elections would be as bad as people were predicting. That, you know, it would kind of control itself. And I think we've seen in the years since then that was just wrong. It was simply an inaccurate prediction. And so, you know, if they were to ever reconsider it, if there was another case that was to reach that level, that might be something they would want to think about.
There are times with the Supreme Court where you have to wonder if they're naive or disingenuous. And I think this is one where it's hard to believe they actually were that naive. Just as I believe when they killed part of the Voting Rights Act, it's hard to believe that they were naive enough to think that would not lead to voter suppression in many places. But yeah, it's Citizens United has had a huge impact, and it has greatly emphasized the role of people with big money. And, you know, even some organizations that people normally think of as progressive or liberal, ACLU was on a very different side than the League of Women Voters on Citizens United. ACLU saw it as defending the rights of unions. Well, unions don't have nearly as much money as all these corporations and incredibly wealthy families that are pouring money in. I mean, individual families are having a huge impact, even at a national scale.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. What's the impact of dark money on our election process?
Well, I'll start on that. The answer would be very broad, I think. As I said earlier, because of the fact we don't know exactly how much is being spent, we only have a minimum. And it takes quite a lot of effort, by the way. I mean, Andy Brown and I spent several hours trying to calculate how much these groups are spending. We actually don't even know exactly the implications that it's having. As Lynn was talking about, when the trial lawyers were spending significant amounts of money to try and get Larry Martin out of the state Senate, they were not talking about the issues that they cared about. They were talking about the issues that they thought would rile up Republican voters and pickets. When this year, the dark money groups were spending in Luke Rankin's race, they were spending pretty much all of their money on ads that talked about abortion, talked about other social issues that we know tend to, be important to Republican primary voters. One thing we frankly know about abortion groups, both pro-life and pro-choice, quite frankly, is that they are not the wealthiest interests. They do not have a ton of money to spend in these elections. The odds that they were the ones who were actually behind those ads is extremely small. The folks who are behind those ads, again, are either lawyers or business groups or, individual families, people who have other interests in these races. As a result, one implication, one ramification of this is, we're already living in a very polarized country, a country that is getting more polarized by the year. The fact that all these ads are playing on those divisions probably, plays into that and potentially makes it worse. And because of the fact that they do not have to reveal who they are, they're not going to have any, there's no reason for them to feel any shame about that because they don't have to take responsibility for it. So that would be at least one ramification of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he's very right. Jamie's very right that it's amplifying our divisions and increasing our polarization. When polling is done with very careful language on particular issues, we see that, yes, there are serious differences in our country, but we are not as badly divided as one would think from some of what the outcome, because there's so much money poured into amplifying differences. And if you listen to some sources, the message isn't even about any issue. It's the people on the other side hate you. Don't you hate them because they hate you? I mean, it's just that simple. And so, yes, it's having, I think, a very damaging ability on our nation's ability to act as a whole for the common good.
Just 2 quick points, Paula. I think first off, the money is predominantly being spent on television ads. I mean, that's a super big expense, and that's a key point. And Jamie's talked about some of those local examples. And again, as I said before, Republicans got out quick, but this is not just a Republican thing. Dark money. Democrats kind of won the dark money race in 2018, and then based on some preliminary numbers from 2020, and it's hard to actually look at dark money in real time. I mean, it's a little easier once it's already happened, but it's still difficult. But I was able to see that Democrats have the edge currently in Senate races. When they look at the dark money spending in Senate races, according to one analysis, 85% were ads by liberal groups. In House races currently, 65% of ads were by liberal groups. And so, again, too soon to tell for sure, and the dust hasn't settled for 2020. We've still got a couple of months to go, or at least a month and a half to go. But it looks like Democrats have definitely figured out how to play in this environment, which probably doesn't make Lynn very happy. She doesn't want anybody playing in this environment, but it is something that, you know, Democrats are doing and have figured out how to do.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. How do I recognize a dark money ad? This is a fun question.
That is a great question. Gibbs was mentioning this earlier. This is not a foolproof way, because some of these groups are not dark money groups, to be clear. But, you know, when you hear, I mean, let me pull up some of the ones that we had in 2018. State Solutions Incorporated, the Conservative Leadership Alliance, the Palmetto Prosperity PAC, the American Future Fund, South Carolinians for Ethical Leadership, Citizens for a Working America. All of these phrases that would sound good to just about anyone, right? Especially in a general election. In a primary, you know, they probably use phrases that appeal to those primary voters. So in a Republican primary, they'll have conservative in their name. In a Democratic primary, they'll have progressive in their name. By the way, these groups will sometimes pop up a week before the election. I mean, they will not have even existed a week before, you know, longer than a week before the election. So one way, again, not a foolproof way, but if at the end of the ad it says paid for by this really great sounding group that everyone would love, that might be an indication that it is a dark money ad. You know, what they cannot do, of course, is say that it's paid for, or what they will not do is say it's paid for by this candidate. You know,
Right.
The one clear way that you at least know it's not from the actual campaign is that if it doesn't say paid for by Lindsey Graham, paid for by Jamie Harrison, there are sort of in-betweens where, you know, you have super PACs or PACs that do disclose their donors, so they're not what we would consider dark money groups. But then there are this other category of groups, again, that normally have very cheery sounding names that you do not have to disclose at all. And the only way to really find out is probably to Google around and to see if you can find any information about these groups. If you cannot, I mean, you know, first of all, I would search the FEC website and see, do they come up there, or the state ethics commission website and see if they come up there. If they do not, then odds are they are a dark money group.
Something I would add is, as important as social media is for everybody now, if you Google a group that has the money to put on TV ads, they have money. And if they are not being elusive about who they are, they're going to have a website. They're going to have a Facebook presence. They're going to say things like, this is our board of directors. This is our executive director. This is our mission. This is why we exist. It may not be 100% honest, but there'll be something like that out there. If it is, for example, a civic group that is in operation for a long period of time and has no fear about your knowing who they are. But if you start Googling the Citizens for a Warm and Fuzzy South Carolina, and there is no reference to them anywhere, or if you go to their website and it won't tell you who any of the actual human beings affiliated with it might be, and doesn't give a clear explanation of their mission, then that's not somebody you want to believe. They may even be right, but you shouldn't take their word for it.
Yeah, the Center for Responsive Politics, and I'm sure many league members know about this. You know, if you Google Center for Responsive Politics or Open Secrets, you can see a lot of the money that's raised and a lot of what's out there. I mean, you know, to sort of talk about some of the ones on the national level and to build on what Jamie was saying, you know, there's America First Action, which if you follow the presidential election, you can probably guess that's Donald Trump's. I think that was started by Linda McMahon from the wrestling, that's professional wrestling fame. so far, I think they've spent 55 million against Joe Biden, is my favorite stat, and 45,000 for Donald Trump. So, you know, they are going after Joe Biden, America First action, based on, and that was, I think that was as of today. Another one that's kind of a famous start, you know, is the Americans for Prosperity, which I think was started by the Koch brothers. They're investing heavily now in Senate elections. They've put nearly 5 million in the North Carolina Senate race. You know, there's 2 Senate races in Georgia, so they're investing in that. And then a couple of the Democratic ones, although again, it's like, I think I'm onto something. I think I found one, and then it's unclear, did they change their name from 2018 to 2020? But Majority Forward was a big spender on the Democratic side in 2018, and I think they're still working in 2020. And then Duty and Honor, so that kind of wins the day. Like, who is not for Duty and Honor? But I believe that's a Democratic organization that's considered to be a dark money group. So.
Okay, this next question fits with the previous question. What information can I find out about these dark money groups? All of you mentioned some things that you could do to find out more. Any other suggestions besides what's already been mentioned?
I mean, you know, the answer to this question is the problem. You're not going to find out anything about them. I mean, you know, unless you have remarkable detective skills. You know, there was, in Rankin's race, there was a group that was funded by an LLC, who the sources of money for which do not have to be disclosed under the law. The LLC did. We were able to find that they did put an address for the LLC. So there's an address for the LLC. The address, what you call up the person who owns that address, they have never heard of this dark money group. They've never heard of Luke Rankin. This group just put down a random address in Greenville, and you know, and that was the end of it. So even if you do go through the process of trying to dig up these groups and track down their information, there's a good chance you still won't be able to find anything about it. You know, you might say that should be illegal. Well, you know, the problem is that the folks who would enforce that type of thing are generally underfunded, undermanned, have no teeth, and so they don't do anything about it. You know, the answer to the question of where can you find some information about these groups is you probably can't.
There was a case in recent years where I was speaking with an attorney who specializes in ethics, and he was representing a candidate, and he actually went to court to get an injunction against a group that it didn't even, I mean, the one thing you are required to do is at least make up some kind of name. And they didn't even bother to make up any kind of name. I mean, they were like minimal effort. There was not even warm and fuzzy South Carolina. And so, you know, he went to court and got an injunction based on the fact, but then all they had to do was tack a name on, and they were back within the law. So one other approach you might try, though, if you're genuinely very concerned about a particular message, is to call the campaign office of whoever's being attacked. If there's anybody who's trying to put some real energy into figuring out who it is, and probably already has, that's where it's going to be.
Okay. Any other responses for this question? I noticed that we have a few things in the chat box, and that's good. If you want to hold that question there, we will go to questions after we get through this series of questions. So don't be worried that we're not going to answer your question. We're just holding it till the end. Okay. What's the impact of dark money on news?
I guess that's my area. That's a tough one. You know, for one, you know, there could be, and we have seen a little bit of this, and when we talk about, this is actually the origin of the term fake news. You know, one thing that these dark money groups can do is actually set up websites. Not just TV ads. They don't just have to do TV ads. They can send out mailers. They can set up websites. And something we saw in the 2016 election, again, was the origin of this term before it kind of got wildly misappropriated, was people would set up websites that looked like news sites and had completely fake information on them to try to trick voters into believing things that were not true. And, they were effective. Because they some of them were made quite well. So, the effect of that on my industry, of course, is that it erodes trust in the news. If people are seeing things that they later learn to be not true, they may think that it's our fault, when in fact it's people who are deliberately trying to deceive you. Another area is, because of the fact that these ads may or may not, the ads themselves may or may not be accurate, you're misleading voters on that front as well. And, hopefully they will turn to sources like the Post and Courier, and I'll put in a plug there, and we have some subscribers on the call tonight. It creates a much messier information environment. And that can be confusing, and it creates, in some cases, totally different realities that the voters are living in when they are deciding who to vote for.
Yeah, and social media obviously exacerbates that problem because, everybody on this call, knows people and has their friends and sees things in their friends' news feed. And it's just like, what in the world is that source? So, if you look at a lot of news, you can pretty quickly spot it. But if you're not a big news person, you can see stories and information shared, and it could very easily be from some type of dark money group that is really, completely false, not fact checked, to sort of completely change the narrative. And so, it'd be one thing if it was just a website, but it's also being shared on social media in a way that really kind of, makes those groups more effective, but erodes our democratic process.
Okay, as far as, and here's a question, once again, that's coupled with the previous one. How can the public trust news sources?
Well, it can take some research. You have to know who is, who's funding these news sources, how independent the newsroom is from that funding source. I mean, so I can, tell you, for example, that the Post and Courier is family owned, and has been for generations in the Charleston area and in South Carolina. But that's not the only thing you need to know. You need to know that I don't talk to the family. I literally never had a conversation with them. When I cover the stories that I cover, I don't know or care what they think about it. I'm covering it from an objective, independent viewpoint. And they are not influencing my coverage one way or another. Of course, the majority of news coverage around the country these days is coming from major corporations that have a whole bunch of newspapers all over the country. That does not mean you should necessarily by any means trust them less. I mean, they are also doing a lot of good work. My friends at McClatchy newspapers in South Carolina or Gannett newspapers in South Carolina, their management structure is different, but they're still doing a ton of independent reporting. There of course are far less independent or far less objective news sources out there. The best way to figure out what the truth is to make sure you're reading a wide variety of news sources, and hopefully you can kind of figure out objective truth from either partisan or otherwise opinionated journalism. So, you know, that's a huge question, but I hope that at least gets a little bit towards the answer.
I'd like to add to it, you know, if you pay attention to these things, just today there was chatter on social media as well as articles in well-established journalistic sources. You know, a very popular cable TV personality was successfully defended in court on grounds that by his own defenders, by his company, by his network, that nobody would seriously believe he was trying to tell the truth.
Okay.
The whole defense of the man was,
I saw that.
let's just say, Tucker Carlson here, that he did not, that no one would believe he was a credible source of news.
Yeah.
And when that happens, if you actually continue to pay any attention to that source, I can't help you. You know, it's just over the edge.
Well, and I think, I don't know that people pay as much attention to, you know, that, you know, there's a division or a wall or a line, and obviously Jamie can speak to this more, between the editorial team and the news team. And so, you know, when you see a newspaper endorse a candidate, or you see somebody, you know, that is not somebody that, you know, Jamie is not part of those conversations to the best of my knowledge. I've always had it explained to me.
Yes.
But that's a distinction that probably a lot of people maybe don't totally get or appreciate as much as they should.
No, you are speaking my music there, Gibbs. That is a problem that I encounter all the time. And, you know, I think a part of the problem is on our end, that there's not a clear enough differentiation between the editorial board and the newsroom on the public facing aspect. I can certainly tell you internally, I learn when our editorial board is endorsing a candidate at the same time that all of you do, when it goes online, or when it goes into the newspaper. I do not talk to them. They are completely separated from the newsroom. You know, I think it is a common misperception that they are somehow one and the same. And I frankly, you know, don't know if our industry has done enough to combat that misperception and make it clearer, the distinction between them. But that is a very important point, and one that I find myself wanting to shout from the rooftops.
Looks like we lost Paula for just a second.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. Well, now we can't hear you, Paula. We can give Paula a chance to sort of catch back up with her feed. Sarah, I know you've been taking some questions from Facebook Live and from chat. You'd like to go ahead and ask one of those while we're waiting for Paula to get back on?
Sure, that's a good idea. Let's see. We do have a question from chat from Philip Sneed. What precedents led to the court equating money to speech?
Yeah,
I can speak to that a little bit.
All right, go ahead, thanks.
Yeah, so this is Gibbs Knotts. So, you know, there were some, you know, kind of an initial batch of reforms kind of in the Watergate era, Federal Election Campaign Act that were around in 71 and around in 74. And, you know, looking back, you know, those were pretty good. I mean, that was a good effort to do many of the things we're talking about tonight. This Buckley versus Vallejo decision from 1976 upheld a lot of that legislation, but, you know, you know, I think that was the court case where this assertion that money is speech was first asserted, and it's kind of held up in various forms throughout. And so, you know, I think Jamie's correct. You know, the Citizens United turned precedent on its head, but this money is speech dates back to this 1976 Supreme Court decision. I will say I am not a Supreme Court or constitutional expert, so if somebody needs to fact check me on that, please do.
Did anyone else want to chime in on that question?
That's my understanding as well. And when I debate even friends who are colleagues who are on the other side of this issue, Buckley, the yayo comes up all the time. It's still a very important case.
All right, I'm gonna combine sort of a question. We're getting some education questions, school board questions in chat from Bonnie Cleveland, also George Temple, Facebook, and they all kind of tie into sort of general questions. We know there's been dark money spending. You know, y'all given some examples, but even as local as a school board election, what types of money groups are trying to influence school board elections?
I'd say that it's a wide range because there are people who have a strong economic interest in it. I know from the chat here that one of the questions is, you know, is this mostly by folks who want to support religious schools? But it's not just about religion. Think about what it would mean financially to people who wanted to get into the business of converting public education into private, of how much money that really involves. And so anytime there is a religious element or you know, moral claims, you also need to look for the you know, this is known in Latin, it's so old, qui bono, who benefits? And it's often a wide range of folks, and very often money is involved.
Yeah, I would say, so for one, I would certainly encourage folks to read an excellent story one of my former colleagues, Paul Bowers, wrote in 2019, in March 2019. It was the same day that we published Andy Brown's story about dark money more broadly. He wrote about a single organization called the Charleston Coalition for Kids, which launched about 5 months before the 2018 elections, and endorsed 4 candidates. All 4 of them won. They spent 200 and what total did he come up with here? It was like $235,000 or something like that, just on the Charleston County School Board races, just on television commercials. You know, Paul asked them a good number of questions. They did have, you know, folks, unlike some of these other dark money groups, they, you know, you actually have people you can call. Some of these dark money groups, you don't even know who to reach out to because there is no contact information for them. You know, he spoke to them and they outlined sort of a broadly pro-charter school message, not quite as aggressive as some pro-charter school groups and pro-school choice groups have been. But that tends to be, you know, a big element of it too. It's not just religious schools. It's, you know, there are folks who just support school choice as a political matter. You know, folks who think that is a solution for education reform. So, you know, again, it's another example of just a single group making a huge impact on these races. And you know, the lower down the ballot these races get, the easier it is to influence with a single group or 1 or 2 groups and a huge amount of money. Because they're not combating that much money, right? So the actual candidates themselves have barely any money in these races. And so, you know, whichever, you know, whatever group it is, they're the only group that's on TV. They have no one else, you know, opposing them. Yeah, we've certainly seen it happen, you know, all the way down at the school board level. You know, I would expect that will continue.
Thank you for that. Paula, do we have you back? We were just taking a few questions.
Yes, yes, I'm sorry about my connection. How do South Carolina ethics and campaign finance laws influence how we handle dark money?
We don't handle it. We don't have the laws that would allow us to handle it in any meaningful way. We don't handle it as we should by having an easy route to the Ethics Commission website where you could see who their donors are, what their expenditures are, who's behind it. We simply don't have the legal grounds to deal with dark money. And that won't change until there is a lot of public pressure. I know, lobbying at the State House works if they believe you have a lot of people behind you that agree with you. And it doesn't work if they believe that nobody out there really cares. And I would say that one of the worst obstacles in working on any ethics issue, and certainly the dark money one, at the State House or anywhere else politically, is the cynicism in the electorate. The belief that everybody is dirty somehow, everybody in politics is up to something, they all do it, you'll never stop it. None, these things are not true. Everybody isn't dirty. There are people with very good ethical and moral compasses, and there are people trying to do the best thing they can for the public. And when you change the rules, you actually do change behavior. And one of the things you do is not just change behavior for people who want to be out of line. You change the behavior of people who don't really have that bad an intention, but without some kind of law as a framework, they don't know what they should be doing. So you might have a group that is effectively dark money because they don't see any reason to be anything else. They might actually be pretty naive if they're at a low level with a relatively small budget. So laws both give guidance to people with good intentions and help control the ones who don't have good intentions. But excessive cynicism is the enemy of good ethics reform.
So yeah, and to throw some data at Lynn's point that she's been making throughout the evening, this group followthemoney.org rated states in 2016 based on their contributor disclosure scorecard. And this is not going to shock you guys probably, but South Carolina got a D. So it was not particularly good at the disclosure. And, that's just something that, you're going to have to put pressure on your elected officials and let them know that this really matters to you to try to get that type of stuff changed.
So one last thing I would add is, and this is a problem for a lot of issues and a lot of groups, is, there are a lot of issues, right? And there are a lot of issues on voters' minds. There are a lot of issues that lawmakers deal with. And, perhaps partly due to that cynicism, ethics in government and ethics laws just does not rise to the top of them for a lot of voters. People are worried about the economy. People are worried about healthcare. People are worried about climate change. People are worried about social issues. And if the people who are running for office do not think that your vote is dependent on how they are going to vote on ethics laws, it's going to matter much less to them. They're gonna be campaigning and serving on the issues that they think matter to their voters. A lot of you probably care about other issues than just this. And understandably, there's a lot of issues going on. And so part of the problem has been the fact that there's limited time and capacity for lawmakers to deal with various issues. Now, with that being said, certainly part of their lack of doing anything about it has been either that they like the fact that it works this way and they don't want to change it, or that they're kind of apathetic about it. It's never been a problem for them, so it's kind of like, why do they need to do anything about it? But as I mentioned at the very beginning, Luke Rankin, who got targeted, he in his defense, and he pointed this out, he had supported some of Shane Martin's efforts or Larry Martin's efforts to change some of these laws. And in the past, but he's even more supportive of it now, I think. And when you talk to campaign finance experts, they'll tell you, every single one of these folks eventually will get targeted by this stuff. Perhaps unfortunately, if you want to see change, they don't recognize the problem until it comes for them. It will come for them someday, but until that happens, it just doesn't rise to get their attention.
The other thing is,
One more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
They do pay attention to constituents more than you would think at times, especially with a House member in South Carolina doesn't have that many active constituents who really reach out to them. On dark money, one of our problems is that while for most people who are concerned about good government and ethics, they're not, in fact, reaching out to their legislators much, but it's a front and center issue for some libertarian groups to avoid disclosure. And so they do hear from libertarian groups saying, we will never forgive you if you pass a disclosure law. And they usually bring up things like, well, some poor school teacher in Hilton Head might be penalized. Their business might be affected if it was known that they donated to this group. That's not fair. And, I think it's honest to say, most of us don't care where the school teacher in Hilton Head sends their money. I'm concerned about where the Mercers and the Kochs and the whole gang of corporations that pour money in and large organizations are spending thousands. So I would be very happy to see bills pass, even if they had pretty high dollar thresholds to kick in.
Okay. We have one more formal question, and then we have some that are on chat, and we may be able to take a couple more. And this question is related to, it touches on some things that have been discussed. What can we do to create a more transparency around campaign financing in South Carolina?
So I'll make a pitch for kind of looking at other states. Again, that's the thing about having 50 states. Some people are doing this well, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So there probably are models about some regulations that can be changed and disclosure requirements that can be changed. And then, something that, I don't think is going to be the first thing that the legislature does when they reconvene their session. But, there are other states that are doing clean elections programs, matching funds programs. I mean, some type of public financing, is a way to, really clean up the system. And so I'd say sort of you can do some things on the disclosure side, but there are states and municipalities that have, real plans to get money out, and we shouldn't just assume they're great. We can go see how they're working, see what some of the results are, and then, potentially do some of those things here if they're making sense in other places. Specifically,
Gibbs, what would be some examples of states or municipalities?
Yeah, so Arizona has a clean elections program. I don't know if Lynn, Lynn, I think you said something about having some Arizona. I mean, something like that is, you have to raise $5 contributions from 200 people. And then, so it's like smaller contributions from a large number of people that will qualify you for something. A matching program is kind of what you'd what you would expect. I think Hawaii has a matching program where, you end up, if you raise a certain amount, you get matched. And people forget this, but not too long ago, all presidential candidates, especially were public finance. It was that box you checked off on your income taxes. I think it was Obama that was the first to decline, feeling like he could, because if you take the public money on the presidential election, you have to give up, you have to say, I'm going to adhere to these spending limits. And I think the Obama team just thought, this is not going to, we can raise more money, this is not worth it. And so I think now there hasn't been a certainly a general election candidate that's done that over the last few cycles. But there are things we can do to pull money out of politics if people are willing to do it. And it's really not that much money in the grand scheme of things, but my sense is that might be a hard sell in South Carolina right now.
Okay. All right. We're going to move to some questions from the audience. Sarah, my chat box, as far as what was in my chat box, was removed when I was disconnected. So, are there any other questions that were not answered from the chat box?
Yes, and we might have a few from Facebook Live, but Philip Sneed, we have another question from him, and he brought up the Jane Mayer book, Dark Money, which is a great resource. And he says that Jane Mayer's accounts in recent years of dark money tended to focus on powerful families like the Kochs. Do such influential families continue to be major dark money players? And is this the case in South Carolina? Or are they are they now surpassed by professionally managed, apparently grassroots operations? I guess kind of what are you seeing, if you can see them at all, in South Carolina?
Those are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And one case that comes to mind is not strictly what we've been talking about, but is basically lobbying, and that's the Federal Constitutional Convention push. And in a subcommittee meeting in the Senate, one of the out-of-state attorneys who showed up to argue for this thing was asked, who is paying you? Who is supporting your organization? They've got one of these warm and fuzzy United States sort of names. And it turned out he could name 3 people, 3 billionaires who want to have a federal constitutional convention, who were, in fact, representing the great bulk of the money behind that. And so, but they brought in, and for a number of years, this was easier to deal with because they did not bring in grassroots people. In the past year, they learned they need to bring in grassroots people because it doesn't help if they have everybody from South Carolina say, no, we don't want this. And then just a couple of folks from out of state coming in for these organizations. And so they have managed to grow themselves some grassroots. And but that grass is watered with the money from these same sources. So these are not mutually exclusive. And I think very often the grassroots don't understand fully that they're being manipulated. And of course, some of them they may know exactly what's going on, but in any case, these are not mutually exclusive patterns.
Yeah, I would, first of all, I would say everyone should read Jane Mayer's book. It is outstandingly good. It's a fascinating read, and it is very informative about this stuff. And as Philip said, it is all about the Kochs, who, by the way, have played in South Carolina like they have everywhere else. South Carolina, and I can say this coming from Texas, if you do not want to, if you oppose the influence of dark money, it is better actually to be in a state like South Carolina than it is to be in a state like Texas, because South Carolina does not have as many extraordinarily wealthy families as a state like Texas. There is a lot of oil in Texas, and there are a few families who are multi-billionaires. We have very, very few of those in South Carolina. The Wilkes brothers, who helped fund Ted Cruz's campaign, also have more or less purchased the Texas State House. They fund basically every candidate who wins the Republican primary gets money from this set of brothers who are very wealthy oil magnates. So in some ways, South Carolina benefits from that, but there are certainly families who are not from South Carolina and play influential roles in some of these groups. And of course, even if these groups are also funded by corporations or by interest groups, there can be, there are families behind those too. So certainly the central concept behind all of this dark money is it is a small group of people spending a lot of money, whether they are blood related or not. That's the basic gist of it.
I read one suggestion, and I was going to ask Jamie this on the Luke Rankin, that is it the Florida Energy Company Nextera, did they thought they might have been funders, but was anybody able to figure that out, or is it just?
There was a lot of speculation because of the fact that Nextera is trying to buy Santee Cooper, and Senator Rankin has been one of the most important and most powerful opponents of selling Santee Cooper. That sort of automatically makes people speculate like, hey, wait a minute, here's this corporation that has the opportunity to make a ton of money if this guy loses his race. That's a good investment for them to try to unseat him. We did not have any definitive proof of that, I don't believe. But it's the same example with Larry Martin in 2016. Who stands to benefit if Larry Martin loses? It's the trial lawyers. So for them, it's a good investment to spend all that money. It may seem like a lot, spend all that money. You're going to make way more money if he's not there and is not passing laws that do not favor trial lawyers.
Yeah, and keeping things in proportion, what is a lot of money for a race in Pickens County is going to be, a drop in the bucket for many other political issues.
Sarah, are there any other questions, or is that about it?
Well, I think I have maybe a good final one, and it's sort of a combination of some different things that have come in. Donna Pernice is someone on Facebook Live who's had this question. Let me find it. It kind of ties in with some others. So sort of what can we do? Like the average voter, we know, you talk about change bills and different things like that, but the average person, the average voter, what can they do to combat dark money, or to raise awareness about it, I guess?
Well, one thing they definitely need to do if they're concerned about it is to tell their representatives and their senators that they are concerned, because if they don't, we're not going to have any change. But you can also draw attention to these things publicly. If you see social media flooded with what appears to be dark money messaging, it doesn't really usually pay that much to try to argue with people on social media. You can waste a lot of time that way. I think some people do, but certainly you can just say, I'm not aware of what your interest is in this. You can ask questions, but fundamentally what's needed to avoid people having to go to all the work that Jamie was talking about to get information is to get to the legislators, so that it has to be reported in the first place, so that it doesn't require somebody spending weeks of their time to find out what's happening.
I have one more, Paula, unless you want something else.
Okay, so let's go ahead and close the event for tonight. We want to thank Gibbs and Jamie and Lynn for their time and their expertise. And as far as League of Women Voters Charleston area, the team that put this together, Leslie Scarden, Shayna Howell, Sarah Johnson, Barbara Griffin. So we want to give them a hand as well. And we thank you for attending, and please look forward to our next, we'll be sending out information about our next Connect meeting that joins the League of Women Voters Charleston area with various community concerns and challenges. So thank you for listening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.